Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is an award-winning actor, producer, and at one time a federal politician. Tina Keeper is perhaps best known for her role as Mountie Michelle Kenidi on North of 60. She's gone on to act and produce numerous film and television projects. Tina is a member of the Order of Manitoba and the recipient of the Earl Grey Award, a Lifetime Achievement Award for her exceptional work in Canadian television. Tina, absolute pleasure to have you join us here on the show this week.
Thank you, Miigwech. It's such an honor to be here. I'm very thrilled. Yes.
Not as thrilled as we are, I'm sure, but lots to talk about, so let's get into it. And I guess, you studied theater at the University of Manitoba or Winnipeg, trained some pretty huge acting schools as well. Was acting something that you knew that you wanted to do pretty early on?
Early in my life, I knew that I was really interested in being an artist from the time I was a child. So I had my parents had friends that were artists. I knew Ojig from the time I was a little girl. Norval Morso was, part of the, my parents' arena. And so I grew up, very much influenced by the idea that you could be an artist and that that arts were part of our culture. And so it was actually in 1980 or 1979, here in Winnipeg, there was, a group of, we were sort of the first wave of urban Indigenous youth, and the Friendship Center was very active at that time. They created, it was actually, I think, Errol Canistano and Kathy Samard, there was Jim Compton, a few people. They created a Native theater group. And that was really inspired by the Native theater that was going on in Toronto, and Northern Lights that was happening as well. There was people like Graham Greene and, Thompson Highway and Gary Farmer, all these people that were part of this, early movement of theater, because it was a way to find our own voice and our own aesthetic and in this sort of Western, medium. And it was really fun. So, yeah, it was part of just my growing up.
Some great names there, people that are still super active today. Gary on Res Dogs. I just watched Graham last night on The Last of Us. What was your big break?
Oh, my big break undoubtedly was North of 60. It was not something I planned as a career. I didn't think that I could have a career as an actor. So I was actually planning I wanted to be an academic. I was in university still, just finishing a degree. I had been accepted into a pretty prestigious program, and I thought that, again, because there was no APTN at that time. There was no broad place, part of mainstream Canada, alongside mainstream film, television, or theater that you felt you could sort of aim for, and I really wasn't. I think I was more practical than a lot of real artists, and not that I don't think of myself as an artist, but I also had a very practical sense. So I did a double major. I always thought in life you have to have a plan B, and my degree was also in history. So that was sort of where I was aiming, and. Jordan Wheeler from here in Winnipeg. Jordan and I had done a lot of community theater together. His sister Winona was, was a history professor, and she was one of my icons. And Dr. Winona Wheeler, to this day has a very prolific place in Canada as a historian. So there's just all these opportunities I felt, and I didn't think that I would ever work as an actor. So Jordan got a job on the writing team of North of 60. I remember we had a going away party for him, and it was like, oh, my little brother's going off to the world, And And then he called one day and he said, do you want to audition for this role? And I said, sure, because I thought, even if I get one day on one episode, it'll pay for the broken gasket in my car.
Right.
Like, I was a student and I didn't, it's like very limited budget I was living on. And so I thought, as long as I'm in their library, I'll send in a tape. I didn't know what to do. I hadn't been on a TV set ever. And then I got the call to do the audition. And then I got another call back, and it happened over the summer before September of 1992. So it was very strange. It was really outside of how I saw my life going. I never in a million years imagined I would have been on a television show. And once I started the work, because I was able to work with people like Jordan. Jordan was there on the writing team. We were all in, Lynx River is actually a set that is built in a provincial park, which also has a land claim on it by the Sutana people, so it's right alongside Sutana First Nation and in the Kananaskis. And it's so beautiful. But I got to work with people like the late Tina Bomberry and Gordon Tutusas and Errol Canistano, who was part of our original theater group. It was a wonderful team of people. So it didn't feel as alienating as I thought it would.
Right.
Yeah, I think that what was really difficult for all of us, a lot of us, was how successful it was. We didn't anticipate that. So I thought I was going to do a year, deferred my year at school, and then come back to, my regular life.
Well, I was going to ask you, for people of my age, Beachcombers have been off the air a couple of years. North of 60 came on, and here's Dakota House with his leather jacket and his earring, and just it was a big show for people my age and for a lot of people. Did you know that it was going to be what it was?
No, we had no idea. To this day, the co-creator Barbara Samuels and I, we're good friends, and we still cannot get over it to this day. I think on any project, and I know as a producer. And as an actor, when you're on other people's projects, you're always aiming for the magic, but you don't know what's going to hit. You really don't, So I think for this show, from my perspective, I thought Canada is not going to accept a predominantly Native cast. It's set in an Indigenous community. This is too foreign for Canadians, and I didn't think it would last more than one season. And so we were all really surprised by just how well it did. It was really incredible. It didn't sell outside of the Canadian market, because I know, like, for Americans, they would be thinking, well, what are the RCMP and what's the NWT? Right. And then a lot of, I think, other buyers in the world felt, well, where's the teepees and where's the horses? The concept of, a northern Dene, we were South Slavey, representing the South Slavey people, was just outside of, a lot of the international buyers' idea about what Indigenous people were. So I think in that regard, too, it was really important in Canada. I think it was really, it just humanized, I think, the stories, and people understood the stories as being universal. Like, there are so many storylines on North of 60 that, resonate to this day. I still have people that come to me or stop me, and, this is 30 years later, and they talk about a storyline that was meaningful to them in whatever way. And whether it's from a Canadian perspective or from an Indigenous perspective, it's really interesting in that regard. It really touched a lot of people, and I feel that it was, as an actor, it was a you know, was an exercise that was really amazing. It was, you know, there was like, it was done at a time when Canadian television was really, I think, funded to be really, really, just really broad and bold. And I think that, you know, at that time there was probably 11 Canadian dramas on Canadian networks. Mm-hmm. So that is a lot. That was a lot of Canadian television, and that was great. I mean, that was a great opportunity for us to be part of that. You know, we were able to shoot 90 episodes in 5 years. We did 5 TV movies. Mm-hmm. And then I think we really, you know, we became part of the Canadian television landscape. And that's, I think, really important for, you know, Indigenous people. Even though we weren't creators per se on that, like we had Jordan in the writing room, we had a very strong voice, you know, on set. I've got to give it to our producers. To this day, I look back and I think, you know, anything that, like we said in terms of protocols, sometimes it was a bit of a fight, but like things like, you know, the extras can't be separate from us. You can't treat them that way and then actors a certain way. You know, so, you know, they accommodated all of these things. We had to talk to them about use of ceremony, like how do we do those things? So we had to really use our voices, but we had each other, and I think that was what was really helpful. And again, we had people like Wilma Pelly who played, you know, Etsu, and you know, Joe Gomba, his character was played by Jimmy Herman. So we had really strong, you know, people that were on that project. Tom Jackson, again, another person who was a really great, for me, a mentor in terms of the industry and as a profession. You know, gave me a lot of good advice. And then, you know, you work together for all these years, you feel like a family. Like Tom felt like my older brother for a long time. Yeah.
Even some of the extras went on to huge things. Tina, much more to talk about here. We do just have to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Tina Keeper. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. We're blessed this week to have Tina Keeper with us. And we were talking about North of 60. Just one last question on North of 60, because when we had Tom Jackson on the show a couple of years ago, this was when the reboots, everything was being rebooted there, no matter what the show was. And he had mentioned that maybe there was a chance for a return to Lynx River, even like a 6-episode run or something. Is that something that's still in the works?
It is something that I think has been put on the back burner for now, but, you know, I think that that's something that has been brought up a lot. It is something that I personally think that, you know, it's actually something that should be, you know, it'd be fun to do, but I think there's so much more work to do. I think that there's so many creatives and so many people that have, you know, a really, really great, there's a lot of great writers, showrunners, and creators coming up. So my thinking is, like, let's clear the room for, like, something new and exciting, you know, and maybe there's a level of vanity that I just don't want to go back and be an elder in Lynx River. I don't know. You know.
They are right about, you know, there's so many other projects out there, but if anybody needs help writing the funding grants to return to the Lynx River, I'll be part of that. Tina, just kind of moving on, you know, in 2006 you ran successfully for the Liberal Party, became a member of Parliament.
Yes.
Why was politics something that you wanted to get involved in?
Well, I had left television after North of 60, after we finished the series. So the series was done in 97, and my children were young, and my family was here, and I just didn't want to travel anymore and raise my children that way. Like, it was very difficult on the family. So as I said, I had my degree in history, and I had really, through my history degree, you know, come to understand, you know, our role in Canadian history as Indigenous people. You know, learning about the Indian Act, learning about policy development by Canada, learning about what happened to us, and then learning about, you know, from our perspective, what the treaty meant. Like my mother is from the Treaty 9 territory. My late mother was Beardy. And so my mother's grandfather was the chief who signed the Treaty 9 addendum. And so all of that became really meaningful to me too in university. And so when I came home, I decided to work, to like really focus in on that part of my education, start working on behalf of First Nations and Indigenous organizations in communications and doing video production, writing, that kind of work. And I really enjoyed it. But one of the big issues that personally became something that I really wanted to try and find a way to do research and create effective programming was on the issue of suicide. And that was because we lost a dear member of our North of 60 family to suicide. Mm-hmm. He was only 19. And, it really affected all of us to a great degree in that, I think the idea that people have, if you've got certain things or if you have a certain life that appears to look well, that you're going to be free from whatever, this issue of suicide or anything like depression or mental health issues. So that was a really big effect on me, was losing this member of our family. And so I really just started to just on my own, created my own nonprofit company, and we started to do research, and then we created a program through on a model of education, theater and education, and worked with an international suicide research center, and really started to do some work. And then that got involved at the political level, because here in the region, it was there were some First Nations that were bravely affected by it. Mm-hmm. And so we started to then work with them, and then we started to see, at the federal level, they were not funding it, but they're funding research projects that are recommending programming that they are not at all interested in funding. So, and that continues to this day. Yeah. So that's a federal relationship between First Nations and Canada. So, the provincial jurisdictions often, Manitoba, they, still to a large degree will not fund anything on First Nations. So there's never been this kind of, relationship where, a lot of provincial jurisdictions and federal jurisdictions. There is some places in Canada, but not here in Manitoba. And, so that now we see Jordan's Principle as being very, very big program out of the federal government, which it should be. But, back at that time, so we were just starting to work on Jordan's Principle. Jordan was from Norrie House, where I'm from. Mm-hmm. In Norrie House, we also had a, we were the party, the Liberal Party riding. We had the riding there. So we had, so we were really politically active, a lot of us, from Norrie House, a lot of other Indigenous people, friends of mine that were Inuit. We were part of the Liberal Party's Indigenous Aboriginal Peoples Commission. And so in that regard, we felt like we had a voice to make change at the policy level, and maybe even at the level of the Constitution for the party. So in that regard, it was the only place in a political party in Canada where we felt that our voice was going to be effective. And I think that for so many of us, again, where we come from a background, my parents are both from the North, we do have a feeling of self-determination, and there's not that, and we didn't want to operate in that place where people are saying, this is what's best for you, we'll handle it, we'll do it. Mm-hmm. No, we'll do it. You are not listening. These are really it really is important when our voice is the one that is making the changes politically and in terms of policy and in terms of legislation. So that was where I started to get really active in it, was really propelled by the work I was doing on research for suicide prevention, and then on Jordan's Principle. And, you know, at the same time, I had just recently been involved, in 2004, I got involved with the launch of the Stolen Sisters Report from the Native Women's Association of Canada, and was doing a project to support that work too. So again, it was another issue that I just, again, I think by that time, you know, I was, like, my children were young still, but, you know, they were now heading into their teens. And you really think, like, changes are going to happen, like things are not going to get worse. Like, from the time I was a young person, I thought things are going to get better. And then they didn't, you know, and everything has become harder. I think that what I didn't know was that there was going to be, and I don't think Canada knew it either, about this fallout from residential schools, the fallout from the 60s scoop, the fallout from all of these colonial practices that have been devastating for our country. And so really, you know, now when you look at, like, politics, whether it's federal or provincial, you see so many Indigenous people running. Like, when I got elected, I think Gary Morasti and I were like number 5 and 6 of First Nations people to ever be elected to the House of Commons. Now you see 5, 6, 12 people running every single election.
Yeah, record numbers every time.
So it was definitely a tipping point. I think that, you know, I loved that job. I loved being of service. I loved being in the communities. You know, the riding I represented was then called the Churchill riding, now the Churchill Q8 Nook riding. And, you know, to go to communities that have never had an MP show up in their community before. You know, 35 First Nations at that time, and now I know there's more, but, you know, where you felt that not only were you showing up, but you were also working on behalf of them in the House. It was really exciting. I really thought that there is a lot of work that you can do. There's a lot of history to be rectified, and the resources are in those libraries and in the research archives of the House of Commons. So, you know, there's a lot that Canada still has to reconcile. And I think that, you know, right now we are in a really difficult time as a country, I think, because none of us knew what was going to happen from all of these practices, these colonial practices. We didn't know how devastating it was going to be. You know, I think that for us as Indigenous people, you know, one of the teachings I've had is that those are not our ways. So, you know, we wouldn't send our children away. So people might say, well, you know, boarding school's okay, you know, there was good things done. Well, it's not our way. We wouldn't send our children away. That is not how we lived in our communities. Those are not culture. That's not part of our culture. It's not a value that we have. So what we really are talking about is restoring our values and sharing them with Canadians. And I think, you know, I know on the issue of suicide, I've often said is that Canada, as a Western nation, has the highest rate of suicide amongst their youth. So Canadians need to, like, start hearing things too, you know. And I think that as we move together, like, a lot of our restorative practices are good for all Canadians, and I really believe that. I think that, you know, I'm so proud of our ancestors. I'm so proud of our parents and our grandparents for being able to survive what they did, and many of our brothers and sisters and cousins, even to this day, or aunts and uncles, that they survived these practices, you know, that were put in place to destroy us. And they also, like, kept alive a lot of the, you know, the strength and determination of our people that has been there for all time. And I think it's great for us to be able to move forward. And really, I think that it's like an honored place. It's a sacred space to be able to, you know, work towards that service, you know, of restoring.
Good stuff there, Tina. More to talk about. We're just going to step aside for another quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here with Tina Keeper. Stick around.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Face to Face and our conversation here with Tina Keeper. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this week's show, but we have much more to talk about with Tina, so we're going to continue that conversation next week, including more on her time in politics, through Black Spruce, acting good, and so much more. Tina, thanks for being here this week. We'll continue the conversation here on next week's show with Tina Keeper on Face to Face. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for watching. We'll see you back here next Tuesday.